Hello, everyone. You're listening to Democracy Watch, the News Collective's weekly news report, bringing you alternative and undercovered current affairs. Coverage from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. I'm Lakshmi Sadhu.
I'm Max Newman.
And I'm Annie Reuter. It's Thursday, May 30th at 5:01 p.m. We're broadcasting from UBC's Vancouver campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people.
On today's show, we have three pieces. One is the opioid against cannabis access debate. Another takes you into the Bloedel Conservatory, and finally a piece about Crab Park. First up, Alex de Boer takes you on a special trip to Bloedel Conservatory.
I had birds as pets. I had birds on my shoulder. Most of the time as a little girl. Parrots and macaws. But I grew up inland, and we had rivers and creeks, and so we had lush environments. We have bromeliads growing on the trees, and it was just very tropical environment. I come from the state of Oaxaca, which is on the Pacific coast, and my hometown is a fishing village. It's called Puerto Escondido. It's quite known nowadays, and I always wanted to be a gardener because I grew up growing stuff. Everything that we ate, we grew. My grandfather and I grew, and so it became a passion for me since very early in my childhood. And when I came to Canada, I pursued that dream. My name is Lina, Lina Salinas for short. And my connection with Bloedel is that I worked there for about 5 years or so. I started in 2000, and then I stayed there for perhaps 5 years, and then I went for one more year outside in the public parks.
What was the title of your job?
Well, my title was laborer, but I was doing duties as a gardener because I was training apprentices that came through the Bloedel Conservatory.
And so you took care of the plants and the birds?
Yeah, take care of the plants, replant them. The gardener would come and design them, or I would sometimes design them myself. So I was willing and very happy to do a bit of everything. I was just happy to be there. I was just happy to work there. So it was a wonderful experience to have a personal connection and bond with the birds. One of them was Charlie, rest in peace, dear Charlie. He was such a sweet cockatoo. He was very loving.
Could you describe what Charlie looked like?
He was a cockatoo from, I believe, from New Zealand, Australian. He was white with a tinge of like salmon, and he had like an orange crest. When he got either excited or afraid or showing any emotion, he would bend those crests. They're like very fine. When they stand, you can see the bright salmon color. He was the good size, like the size of a macaw, but shorter tail. Black, dark black eyes. Yeah, beautiful. He was just very beautiful.
And you said he would sing and dance. Like, what would he say?
Charlie would mostly mumble, and he just tries to imitate. But the words that he would say, like clearly, would say like, "Hi, Charlie. Hi, Charlie. How are you, Charlie?" Those he would say clearly. Charlie had this personality where he just makes you laugh, and he would make people laugh. All the kids that would come. Charlie would just stay there still, and you think he's just not going to do anything, and then suddenly he starts talking and dancing and making all these kinds of sounds, and people would laugh, and he would laugh too, and then people start laughing because he's laughing, and it was such comical. He was so comical. He sometimes, would have temper tantrums if something wasn't right. He would suddenly bite. They have feelings. They communicate. They tell you when something is wrong. Charlie, for example, he was possessive. He was jealous if another bird would come close to me in particular, because he became very attached to me. So if he was on your shoulder or on your arm, he doesn't want competition. He just wants all the attention to himself. And he liked to cuddle, so we would cuddle. I would cuddle him against my chest, and he would just loved it. Loved it. But he was temperamental sometimes, and this is why not everyone held him. Yeah, unfortunately, I had to take care of personal things, and I was heartbroken when I came back from Mexico, and I heard that Charlie had passed away. It was really heartbroken. Yeah.
What year did he die?
Sometime between 2006 and 2009. They live a long time. These types of birds, macaws and cockatoos, they can live for a long, long time. 80 years or so, and so. They have a lifetime of knowing different kinds of people, and I can only imagine. I'm not an expert, but I can only imagine they get to know people, and they get to spend a lot of time with different kinds of people, and they become attached to these people that care for them, and then suddenly these people leave.
Yeah, one of the volunteers I was speaking with said that parrots often are looking for homes. There's often parrots that need to be adopted.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful that Bloedel is a refuge, not only for people who want to go and have a wonderful time, but also for birds. A lot of people came there to escape the rain. A lot of people came there to take pictures. We just hang out. Bloedel, I think, is a refuge for many, many people in Vancouver when we need a little break or just want to go to a different, like the tropics. You don't have to go so far. Just go to Bloedel.
Yeah, it's like its own little world, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it is such a unique place. It was like coming home. Every day I went to work. It was just wonderful to have the birds there, and the beautiful plants, and the humidity level, and it was just, everything was wonderful. But I still go and visit there and visit the birds and see the flowers, and nice to see some more changes, and it's nice to see that some of the old trees, like palm trees, are still there. And it's just more beautiful each time I visit it. It's more beautiful. I hope that Bloedel will stay open forever. Yeah.
So do I.
Point of land in Vancouver, Queen Elizabeth Park and the Bloedel Conservatory. This unique 140-foot triodetic dome is dedicated to a better appreciation and understanding of the world of
Thanks
plants.
for listening. This piece was recorded, edited, and produced by myself, Alex de Boer. The song you heard is Blue Hearts 1 off the album Blue Hearts in Exile by Gal Grayson. Additional sounds by Alexander Kim. Special thanks to Lina Salinas and the News Collective at CITR.
What a beautiful piece by Alex de Boer. They say love is blind, and Charlie and Lina's story is truly a testament to that. What does everyone in the studio think? We have, for our listeners, we have Annie and Max, but we're also joined today by Armand and Hannah and Melina. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So what does everyone think about the piece?
I think it's really beautiful to have that kind of connection with an animal. My best friend is my dog from childhood, and I can really relate to having that kind of just profound connection with an animal that can be sometimes more profound and more strong than a connection that you have with many of the human beings that you interact with on a daily basis. It's really magical.
I personally haven't been to the Bladel Conservatory yet, so I kind of felt like I was there and could feel like I was in a humid dome with lots of birds around me.
Agreed. I feel like that piece kind of brought you there. I felt like I was transported inside of that dome.
I think one of the things that I found interesting was she emphasized how it was ostensibly a sanctuary for birds, but actually became a sanctuary for people as well. And I think that speaks to the importance of public spaces that people have access to, and also where they can build relationships with animals and their fellow human beings.
And the music I thought that Alex chose to include with the piece was just really beautiful and really fitting, I thought.
Have either of you ever had a relationship like Charlie
With
and
a
Lina's? With a parrot?
No, not yet.
Is that relationship goals? That's hashtag relationship goals for you. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back after a super duper short break.
The AIDS Vancouver Helpline is here to help. Open from 9 to 4, Monday to Friday, the helpline answers questions about HIV and safer sex. Call to find medical support in your area without giving your name. Run by volunteers, the helpline is one of the many programs from AIDS Vancouver combating the HIV epidemic in the Lower Mainland. While not medical professionals, our volunteers answer your questions confidentially and anonymously. The helpline number is 604-696-4666, or contact us at aidsvancouver.org.
I faced it. I have Alzheimer's disease.
My diagnosis has let me get on with my life my way.
The more we learned about my grandfather's dementia, the more we could face the future and make plans.
My husband Tom and I spoke to our doctor right away.
I have Alzheimer's, but it doesn't have me.
I faced it. So can you.
For more information about early diagnosis, visit alzheimer.ca.
I was a prisoner. I was a prisoner of
cocaine addiction.
Cocaine took my drink. It made me lie, steal.
Cocaine took my will, my soul. And all I wanted was more cocaine. Cocaine Anonymous gave me freedom and saved my life. If you got a problem with cocaine, pick up the phone. We're here to help.
Contact Cocaine Anonymous toll-free by calling 866-662-8300 or find them online at ca-bc.ca.
Welcome back, listeners. You're listening to Democracy Watch at 101.9 FM. For those who are just tuning in, we were talking about the Bladel Conservatory, which is actually celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and it opened in 1969. We were talking about a very tragically beautiful love story between a woman named Lina and a parrot named Charlie.
Yeah, and we will continue with a piece which was conducted by CITR's Ande Laidman, together with Sam Jones and Joshua Azizi. Because of the recent National Day of Action of the opioid crisis, which happened a few days before the annual 420 celebration, they began to investigate in which ways the marijuana and the opioid user movements worked with and against each other. They were focusing on the question if the recent legalization of marijuana could impact the decriminalization of opioids and the safe supply movement. So let's take a listen.
We didn't get insight and injection sites by waiting for the government to give them to us. Activists and members of the drug-using community created their own safe spaces in violation of the laws, at the risk of being arrested and losing their freedom. And it was only after those places had been opened, after Van Du and others had created those safe injection sites, that finally the government stepped in and helped create one single solitary place in the whole country here in Vancouver. People need a safe drug supply. That's what we really need.
I think it's quite clear that without the sort of sustained activism of many people, especially in Vancouver, we would not be where we are today.
Poverty is a massive issue. Safe supply is a massive issue. Housing is a massive issue.
You just heard the voices of MJ Malloy, a cannabis science professor at the University of British Columbia, and Sarah Blythe of the Overdose Prevention Society. The National Day of Action for Overdose Prevention occurs a few days before the annual 420 celebration, which embraces marijuana and weed culture. Myself, Ande Laidman, together with Sam Jones and Joshua Azizi, began to investigate the ways in which the marijuana and opioid user movements worked with and against each other. In particular, we set out to answer the question of whether the recent legalization of marijuana could impact the decriminalization of opioids and the safe supply movement. To begin to answer these questions, Sam called Sarah Blythe to get an activist take on the situation.
Hello, Sarah.
Hey.
Hey, it's Sam from CITRs.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. I'm all set up here if you're ready to get started.
Yeah.
Sarah lands in an interesting place where she is both a cannabis and opioid activist. As someone who has been involved with both movements, Sam asked Sarah about how she saw the two movements interacting with each other and the ways in which both communities could work together.
How do you think, the recent success of the marijuana legalization movement will affect the decriminalization of opioids?
I think that, I think that everybody has to work together. I think everybody together is really, really important. The more people who talk about decriminalization of opiates, and even including the cannabis movement, more people together talking, to these issues and supporting each other is really important. The more people who support something, the more likely it is to catch the eye of the people who need to, that we need supporting it.
What do you perceive as the biggest difference between the legalization of marijuana movement and the safe supply / decriminalization of opioid movement?
Well, people are dying in the overdose crisis. It's a difficult situation, and making sure people get safe access to those drugs is really important. They're different, and they can help each other. And I think that allies and understanding of some of the things that have the drug war included cannabis, and in some ways they were able to push and get through that. So any kind of help with that, doing working with drug users groups, building solidarity in a large movement of people, which exists, but the more, the bigger the movement to destigmatize, to have safe access for people, the better, I think. And having a good understanding about what is needed from each group is really important. So getting on the same page, and, I think sometimes, having conversations about these is really important. I think it's a healthy thing to do.
Due to our interest in the policy implications surrounding the legalization of marijuana and the future of the safe supply / decriminalization of opioids movements, I spoke to Susan Boyd, a law professor at the University of Victoria. Boyd specializes in Canadian drug policy and the regulation of women who use drugs. She is also a harm reduction activist and has previous experience working in the harm reduction field in Vancouver's downtown east side.
Harm reduction activist, but also participating with allies moving towards legal regulation of all drugs. So end of prohibition as we know it, sort of as a criminal justice matter.
So from your experience in both that field as well as your academic experience with policy, what societal changes have you seen play out over the past decade or two in response to drug use?
I think since the 1990s, we've had a tremendous amount of change and recognition of the importance of listening to people with lived experience of using drugs or having used drugs in their past. following their recommendations, obviously not quickly enough, but that's a huge change from the past. I mean, with the cannabis movement in the 60s and 70s and on, it was cannabis users and their allies pushing for change. But we haven't seen such a concentrated effort by people who use other criminalized drugs, such as opioids or cocaine or methamphetamine, before the 1990s. It's not to say that there weren't people speaking out about drug prohibition. It was just they were more isolated voices by people with experience of drug use. Part of that movement was the first overdose crisis that we had in the downtown east side of Vancouver in the 1990s, where a public health emergency was declared at that time too, due to the rising overdose deaths and HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C rates. And that was a movement to end prohibition, but also to establish a safer injection site and more diverse harm reduction services for people who use criminalized drugs and legal drugs as well.
So you mentioned the role of activism in both the marijuana and into the opioid communities. Do you see the grassroots movements as being very instrumental to changing policies right now?
You know, one of the differences between the cannabis movement and the movement now in relation to the overdose death crisis is that more people have used cannabis. When you look at drug use rates, you can see that more than 46% of adults surveyed have tried cannabis at least once. But when you look at the data around drug use in relation to, let's say, heroin, less than 1% of adults surveyed have used heroin in their lifetime. And so you have a much larger population that have firsthand experience with cannabis, and you also have a population that, originally was very white and middle class in the 60s and 70s, and that movement started at the universities to end cannabis prohibition and an end to police brutality. But we saw that it moved quickly out of the universities, too, with the Gastown riots. That was the Gastown Smoke-In and Street Jamboree in 1971. People from all, backgrounds came to that jamboree, which was later declared a riot by the Vancouver police. I suppose what became pretty evident for both cannabis users and people who used other drugs, and there's an overlap there, of course, is that the impact of drug use is determined by a person's social class. So poor people, people of color, activists, youth, they feel the brunt of our criminal control, whether that's for cannabis use or whether that's for heroin or methamphetamine use. And so it's never been sort of an equal playing field, and I think that both movements saw that pretty quickly, that the impact of criminalization impacts the most vulnerable and marginalized people in Canadian society. And that's one of the issues, I think, that brings the two movements together, that there is a common interest in relation to drug prohibition as a whole. But because more people use cannabis, more people came to that movement, I think, because of their personal experience.
Yeah, that kind of brings me into my next question, actually. What role, if any, you mentioned there might be a little bit of overlap, but do you see the recent legalization of marijuana playing on the decriminalization and safe supply movements for opioid users?
Yeah, I think there's a huge overlap. And I want to say that in Vancouver especially, there has been an overlap in those movements right from the beginning. And you can see people like David Malmo-Levine. He opened up the Vancouver School of Drug War History and Organic Cultivation in 2004, and he gives drug war history tours, and he opened the Herb Museum in 2007, and in that museum it had beautiful displays of the history of herbs and drugs, including opioids. But he was a friend of Andu, the first drug user union that was established in Canada, but in 1998. Same for cannabis activist Dan Magnuson. He joined David a number of years ago at the museum, but he also started in 2016 with support from Vandu, a cannabis substitution project, sort of a harm reduction program where twice a week he distributed cannabis products out of Vandu to their members. There's no monitoring of how people use it, whether it be for recreational or for medical use. But it's in recognition that there is quite a sort of growing literature about cannabis as a substitution drug for people who are using opioids or other drugs to switch to cannabis use because it's less harmful. I suppose you could say that no one has died of a drug overdose by consuming cannabis, but that's not the same for the crisis that we're in, that people have always been vulnerable to drug overdose when they're buying on the illegal market and consuming those drugs that they bought in the illegal market, because you can't be sure of the quality or the quantity of the drug. But of course we're seeing these rising numbers of deaths because of the poison drug supply, illegal drug supply, in relation to fentanyl as analog, which is quite different than what we've had in the past. But I do want to point out that people are always vulnerable to drug overdose in relation to using opioids bought on the illegal market. But in that way, we see the cannabis activists coming together with drug user unions who are working with people who are using criminalized drugs that are not per se cannabis. When Mark Emery was leading up to his extradition to the U.S. in 2010, a lot of the activists for harm reduction and for end of prohibition, were startled by, not so much startled, I guess that's the wrong word to use, really helped to fight to keep Mark in Canada. Well, that fight failed. He's sentenced to 5 years in a U.S. prison. But again, I think it was a coming together of the movements because everyone saw quite clearly the harms of drug prohibition, the harms of criminalization. And it's not just cannabis criminalization that was a concern. Speak at forums or go to hear other people speaking. I see many of the cannabis activists who fought for legal regulation of cannabis there in the audience and speaking. So, and I think they would clearly state that there's still much more to do in relation to our new Cannabis Act that, still could potentially criminalize quite a number of people because of the severe penalties that are attached to some of the activities related to the Cannabis Act.
Now that Canada has opened the door to cannabis legalization, do you think that the path forward for opioid decriminalization or a ban on prohibition or anything like that is going to come up a lot quicker than it did before in the past with cannabis?
Well, I sure hope so. I wish I had a magic ball where I could predict the future. I think that there's, around the world and in Canada, much more vocalization of, decriminalized drugs right away. This is a public health emergency across Canada. The number of deaths across Canada, these are preventable deaths. So you don't have just people with lived experience advocating for change. You have public health officers and other leading organizations calling for these changes too. I think it's unconscionable that we would allow one more person to die due to this situation. That's completely preventable. If we would move towards legal regulation, if we could provide a safe legal supply of drugs for people who use recreationally or occasionally and, more regular use, and to have those programs that's very flexible and open as well. And I think we could do a good job of looking at each particular drug and seeing what kind of regulation would be the best fit for them. Alcohol and tobacco are most, I guess you could call, dangerous drugs in relation to negative health effects. And we found ways, whether we agree or not, to regulate those drugs with way less penalties than we enacted in the Cannabis Act. But I think we have plenty of evidence and support around the world about how we might go about regulating other drugs. And decriminalization would be a first step, but I don't think it should be the only step, because as long as you have that illegal market selling drugs that are, of unknown quality and quantity, we'll still be in the midst of a crisis.
So are you saying something like to begin with similar to the Portugal model and then continue on from there?
Yeah, I would say tomorrow you could decriminalize all drugs, but I wouldn't want legal regulation to be further down the road, because I don't think decriminalization will save us from this crisis that we're in. I think it will certainly affect individual users, that they wouldn't be detained or arrested for possession, and that would be a huge move forward. I mean, in Vancouver alone, 80% of all drug offenses are for personal possession, 2017. Across Canada, of all the total drug offenses, 72% were for personal possession. If we move to decriminalization of personal possession, let's say, like the Portugal model, then a lot of these arrests, almost 80% of offenses would not happen. So, of course, that would be a major step. But if we really wanted to move away from sort of punitive drug prohibition and regulating people who are using substances in this way through a criminal justice model, then I think we have to consider legal regulation.
So with decriminalization as well, it would allow greater resources to prop up as well, correct?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, so not necessarily. And, I mean, you would hope that would be attached to that change. We declared a public health emergency in BC in 2016, and we did see more resources and funding for harm reduction services throughout the province, for overdose prevention sites, for an expansion of maintenance programs like hydromorphone, Dilaudid, as it's called, by users. We've seen these expansions, but we still are in the midst of an overdose crisis. We can see that the numbers are continuing to climb each year. And so I do believe we have to do something more drastic or more a larger change than just decriminalization.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And just going back to something you said at the beginning of the interview, you said you study women in regards to drug policy?
Yes.
And drug use. Can you touch on that a bit and how that differs from like men? And
Yes, I can. I was always interested. I was a harm reduction worker in the downtown east side, and one of the things that I saw immediately, or anyone who knows women who are using criminalized drugs, that the regulation of them is quite different than men, and that has to do with women being mothers and gender norms around women. And so where men can be seen sometimes as, having sort of a possibly, risque past, bad boy kind of persona, there really is an equivalent for women. But the issue that really is quite different for women is around reproduction and mothering. And so the regulation of women through social services and child protection really impacts them in a way that men are not impacted. Most single parents or mothers in child protection and social work practice, being known as a person who uses illegal drugs, can easily then put you in the position of having your children apprehended from you. But we also had a lot of sort of media attention on women and pregnancy and drug use, and a lot of myths and misinformation in the media about the harms of drugs to the developing fetus and birth outcomes. But what we do know, what the science and the research demonstrates, is that when women are provided non-judgmental health care and care during pregnancy, they can have the same birth outcomes as people who are not using criminalized drugs. And women really are vulnerable and at risk to having their children apprehended if they are thought to be using drugs or wanting to participate in the activism against drug prohibition. That puts them in sort of a public spotlight that actually could bring harm to them and their families.
particularly with Indigenous and minority women as well.
Yeah, and that's where I think we can see with all of drug prohibition and the impact of drug prohibition that it's people of color, Indigenous people, youth, activists are the most vulnerable for arrest. But certainly in relation to women and drug use, historically it's been black women, Indigenous women, poor women who are most at risk, for seeing their families torn apart, but also for being sentenced to prison for drug arrest.
While it is impossible to know whether Canada will move to decriminalize or legalize drugs other than marijuana in the near future, in the midst of the opioid crisis, the demand for safe supply and greater harm reduction measures remain pressing issues across BC and Canada. Music by local band Skim Milk. If you haven't checked them out yet, they're well worth the listen. You can find them on Bandcamp. Interview with MJ Malloy was conducted by Joshua Azizi. The interview with Sarah Blythe was conducted by Sam Jones. And the interview with Susan Boyd was conducted by myself, Ande Laidman. Editing and production by Ande Laidman. And thanks, as always, to Alex de Boer for her intrepid leadership, assistance, and advice every step of the way throughout the production of this piece.
Also, an additional thanks to Max Newman for his last-minute editing assistance on this piece. Listeners, stay tuned to Democracy Watch. We'll be right back after this short break.
Average height got out of a black sedan holding a baseball bat. He approached a dark-haired woman, hit her in the head, then hit her again as she fell to the ground. He continued to beat her ribs, chest, legs, and face until she lost consciousness. He then hit her again, got into his car, and drove away. This is a scene from a video game played by millions. If we want violence against women to stop, shouldn't we stop treating it like a game? Join the conversation at #NotOK.
It's not just rich people that own the media.
But by leaving out the most important things you need to know, they can elevate awareness to a new all-time low.
I own my media.
I own my media.
I own my media. I own my media.
I own my media. I own my media. The Media Co-op is a grassroots national news network that's owned by its members.
But if it's just left out, can you say the paper lied? A lot of things that happened didn't happen after all. If there's no one in the forest who will put it in the news, I guess the tree didn't fall.
Join us today at mediacoop.ca/join. I'm joining today. You should too.
Hi, my name's Matthew. When I first got back from a military tour in Afghanistan, anytime I heard a siren or even a car alarm, I'd lose it completely. I would turn into a wild man, screaming, waving my arms. People would yell at me, "Shut up, you crazy. Get a job, would ya?" Well, I didn't go out and get a job. I got help instead. Now, I'm in a clean and safe apartment. I have friends and helpers who understand me. I landed a decent job, but I gotta admit, I still don't like car alarms or sirens. I used to think mental illness was a death sentence. I got life instead.
This message was produced by Columbian Centre Society and Radio Malaspina in British Columbia.
We don't need to tell you that Vancouver has a housing problem.
Mass evictions.
Mass rent evictions.
Unfair rent increases.
What happened to rent control and protection from unfair eviction?
If these or other housing matters concern you, you may be interested in joining the Vancouver Tenants Union. For more information, visit tenantsunion.ca.
Welcome back. You're listening to Democracy Watch at CITR Radio at 101.9 FM. Next up, we have a piece about expanding green space in the downtown east side. On Monday, the Vancouver Park Board unanimously passed a motion to expand and improve Crab Park at Main Street and Waterfront. This is in the face of the Centrum Expansion Project, a port expansion project slated to start this summer. It will extend the port westward and will block the North Shore views from Crab Park. Annie Reuter spoke with a longtime advocate of Crab Park, Don Larson, about its history and what's next following the Park Board's decision.
Yes, hello? I think about 4 hours.
Yeah, I don't know if the connection here is really great right at the moment, but on the phone here. But anyway, 4 hours? Oh my God, that's punishment.
This is Don Larson, a founding member and longtime advocate of Crab Park. I reached him on the phone after Monday's lengthy Park Board meeting. That evening, the board approved an amended motion requesting the Port Authority to expand and enhance green space in Crab Park and work to build an Indigenous-focused healing center. COPE Commissioner John Irwin brought it forward earlier this month. Parks-related things really interesting in urban green spaces, so I'm personally quite interested in this as well.
Oh yeah, they're under threat, and partly from the Park Board as far as I'm concerned. I'm pretty turned off by those guys down there, some of them.
The threat to Crab Park at Main and Waterfront is the expansion of the Centrum Port Terminal, just east of the park. But the fight for Crab Park began long before the port expansion was approved last spring.
And I am with Crab Water for
In the
Life
1980s, a small group called Crab Water for Life Society dreamed up the park and fought for 5 years to finally get it established in 1987. So, on Monday's park board meeting, Dawn was there, and the week before at a rally.
We actually had to do a rally on May 13th in front of the park board office. We had about 50, 60 people and speakers and placards and banners and such, and I was one of the speakers. And then we had to wait around for hours. They wouldn't let us in the park board chambers, and we were basically not treated very well, in my opinion. There was quite a bit of security on us, and park rangers and private security, which is not there for other people. It was there for downtown Eastside people. I was offended by it, and that's all deliberate, and that was park board related. And then they finally let us in to sit, and we couldn't speak, and we stayed around because we wanted to witness Commissioner John Irwin from COPE make his motion for expanded park space and a healing center of some sort. And everybody has a different idea of what a healing center is, apparently. And also better disability access, probably at Columbia Street, but possibly at Main Street. We don't want Carroll Street because we know that's a tourist access route. That's what is there. That's why some people want Carroll. And some people are the Gastown BIA, and they're the ones that prevented us from getting Columbia Street 15, 20
Access to the park has been an issue for decades, especially for folks with mobility issues. And an access point from Carroll Street is not what Don wants to see. He's worried it will become a park for tourists and not serve the people it was designed to. Access from Columbia Street, 1 block east of Carroll, is a better alternative, says Don.
The park is changing, and it's mostly dog owners and people living in the artist work lofts nearby. They're the ones that are now using the park. And I don't want to see it becoming like just a tourist park. On top of that, I don't want to see tourists coming in at funneled in at Carroll Street in Gastown into the park and become just like a tourist park, because that'll be the final push of the low-income people out of the park. That'll be the end of what we tried to accomplish, which was a park first and foremost, but not only for low-income families and people.
You mentioned accessibility and availability of green space. Those were just a couple of the issues that were raised at the park board meeting. So what for you is the most essential element of this expansion and improvement that's finally been approved after so many years?
Well, it's got approved at the park board level. They don't own the land. The park board sent a letter May 24th, 2017, 2 years and at the time 3 days, and to the port. The parks board sent a letter to the port. It was sent by then chairperson, Green Party person, Michael Wiebe, and he's still the general manager.
This isn't the first time a motion passed to improve Crab Park, but the Parks Board doesn't own the land. The Port Authority does. The port has plans to expand its operations this summer, which could impact Crab Park.
The letters just sat there, and seems to me nobody's done anything. And there was supposed to have been discussion and resolution, and what they were asking for was for 4 acres to be added to Crab Park, and Crab Park is about almost 7 acres, I believe. People tell me various things, but 7 acres. And so we want 4 more acres. We haven't got it. The port has to give okay and permission, and they don't like to give away land. They hated it. We got the park. We worked for 5 years very hard and intelligently, I think, creatively. So lots of work in 5 years and some luck, and we were able to get now called Crab Park at Portside. We just call it Crab Beach, Crab Park. That's what it really is, but the legal name is Crab Park at Portside.
What's made you advocate for Crab Park for so long? It sounds like it's been frustrating at times. So what's made you so committed to this?
Yeah, well, it's very hard to say in a sense, but everyone, I guess, if you have a passion, if you have something in your heart and it's there, and a dream, I guess you could say, a purpose in life if you want. So yeah, those things. And they either happen or they don't, I guess. And I told them at the park board meeting, I said, honor Crab Park, because I don't think they do. And so I was saying to them, honor Crab Park. But I was reminding myself, too, like, that's what I want to do. And I've done that, but, you get older and you get tireder at some point.
Before the advocacy began, Don remembers the first time he went to the future site of Crab Park in the early 80s.
We were walking around back in the day, so a small group of us went down to an industrial wasteland. There was no park. There was no proper access whatsoever to the ocean, Pacific Ocean, rather big ocean, right on the doorstep, but nobody could get there. But we walked across at Columbia, which is where we want the access for disability, a stairs elevator system over the rail tracks is now, because there's lots of tracks down there now. And so to get across the tracks, you need a see-through elevator stair system. And we were trying for it at Columbia, and I still think that's the best location. So we walked across the tracks, that level, that grade, and went down to, it was like, I don't know, it was just, we're sitting on a little wall there, broken down wall, and there was a shack there, which is Timac boat launch. And that was about it down there. And somebody mentioned, well, it would be great to have a park here. I thought that was crazy. I laughed. And anyway, 1 week later, we were back again doing the same thing. And somebody else said, we should get a park here. That'd be great. People throw out these ideas and you never see them again. These are idea people, I guess. But they never actually sometimes do anything. But I thought, I decided, like, I could feel it. I thought, that's what we should do. I didn't know that was going to be 5 years to get the park of hard work and luck and strategy by a group that weren't thought we would be able to get anything. We ended up doing a campaign, illegal occupation of federal Crown Corporation land. And that was 1984 when the landfill had gone. Some of the landfill had gone in, and so we were out there camping for like 60, 10, 75 days. We were very popular with the media that summer. There was lots of characters, and there was colorful tents, and the backdrop of the ocean and the North Shore Blue Mountains, and that's all going to be lost. That's one thing. Almost all the view to the north is being lost by this 7-acre, big as the park, heavy industrial rail and container and freighter expansion in front of the park, about a block in front of the park, and the view is going to be lost. That's one of the reasons we're asking for 4 acres on the west side, so some view will still be had of the north, of the mountains and the ocean.
But it's not just the views being blocked by the port expansion that has Don worried.
In my view, there has been no proper environment assessment, scientific studies done on the Centrum proposal. And this is our central waterfront. It's not just Crab Park. But without Crab Park, there wouldn't be a lot of discussion going on at all.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time out of your morning to talk to me, Don. I really appreciate it.
What time is it? Sorry,
Yeah, it's...
I don't really have a radio that works here, but anyway.
Thank you, Annie. For those who were just tuning into the middle of that interview, that was Annie Reuter talking with a longtime advocate of Crab Park, Don Larson, about its history and what's next following the Park Board's decision. So, Annie, just a clarificatory question. Does CRAB stand for anything?
It does. It stands for Create a Real Available Beach.
Wow.
It's a powerful acronym.
Did everyone know that?
I did not know that.
So what's next?
So from what I understand, now that the park board has passed this, it has to go to City Hall, but it's not actually city-owned land. It's owned by the port. So ultimately, the Vancouver Port Authority will need to approve this motion for it to go forward and for the expansion of the green space and the Indigenous-focused healing center to actually happen.
Very cool. And Don Larson sounds like a very opinionated guy. What did you take away from the whole experience and your interview with him?
I was really grateful that he gave me that much of his time, first off, but I took away that you need that much passion to make things happen because the bureaucratic process can be quite slow. So it was kind of inspiring to hear how passionate he'd been for so long about this park.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Annie. So we have about 10 minutes left until today's episode of Democracy Watch is over. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. But before we say goodbye, Hannah has something very cool to share with us.
Yeah, so I want to present a piece that I put together about the legacy of colonialism that exists today in Vancouver's street names. So my inspiration for this piece was an article by Emma Rennertz called "Oh No, My Street's Named After a Racist." It was published in the Tyee last week. It centers on an Indigenous woman by the name of Jessie Lawyer, who discovered recently that Trutch Street, the street on which her and her housemates live, is named after a very racist figure in our province's history. The man in question is Joseph Trutch, who, while serving as the Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works for the colony of BC from 1864 to 1871, and as the First Lieutenant Governor of the colony of BC from 1871 to 1876, did all that he could to drive Indigenous people, the Indigenous people of British Columbia, from their land and to restrict them to reserves, which he also worked hard to reduce in size as much as possible. Outrageously, Joseph Trutch is not unique in having his legacy honored in our city to this day through his name representing a public place. Many other racist old white politicians from the 19th century are the namesakes of streets, parks, and buildings in Vancouver, like Wilfrid Laurier, John A. Macdonald, and Frederick Seymour, and the list goes on. For this piece, I chose to focus in particular on John Robson, for whom Robson Street is named. In the early 1870s, while a member of BC's Legislative Assembly, Robson proposed an amendment to BC's voting laws to take the right to vote away from Indigenous and Chinese people. That amendment became law in BC in 1874, and Chinese and Indigenous people were disenfranchised. Around that time, he was also among the first Canadian politicians to call for a law restricting the immigration of Chinese people to Canada. This would lead to the federal government's passing of the Chinese Immigration Act in 1885, which introduced a head tax or an expensive immigration fee specifically for Chinese people wanting to live here. Robson believed that Indigenous people would eventually become, in his words, utterly extinct in BC, and that in the meantime it was the responsibility of the provincial government to civilize Indigenous people according to white European standards and to forcibly convert them to Christianity. While the 9th Premier of British Columbia, he continued the creation of Indigenous reserves across the province in order to force Indigenous people from their land, then made that land available to white settlers instead. Yesterday, I stood at the corner of Robson and Homer Street and shared this information about John Robson with passers-by. I then asked these individuals to share their reactions to learning who this iconic Vancouver street is named after. Here's what they have to say.
Changing the name. At the same time, do I feel like there's better uses of civil servants' times? Yes.
I think we need to be as inclusive as possible. We need to look at the balance. Okay, it's pretty obvious that there's so many more things are named after men. So many more historical stories are recorded about men and the things that they do. This is one of the things that we can change. And also, the Indigenous people who populated this land and made such incredible contributions to what we now enjoy in Vancouver need to be recognized as well.
I think there should be a lot more historical Indigenous names on the signs around here. And probably, the Chinese community was a huge part in building this city, so obviously they should get some credit for it too.
Personally, I don't really care for them to be dedicating it towards First Nations or Indigenous communities. It has nothing to do with being pro or anti-Indigenous culture. I understand why it is that we remember and learn and educate ourselves on atrocities or issues that were committed in the past. Personally, my family moved here in 1912. We were Irish, we were persecuted. That's why we ended up leaving Ireland.
But you're living on stolen land, stolen from Indigenous people, right?
Sure, but I mean, all land's stolen. The Roman Empire stole a shit ton of land too. And presumably every empire before that was also stealing land. I'm not saying that it's the right thing to do, but it seems like most culture that has existed from the dawn of humankind, shall we say, it's all born out of egregious acts.
I've been doing research trying to educate myself about truth and reconciliation and what I can do as a settler ancestor. But I am trying to forward more people are educated about this, because it totally changes your views about our city and what our responsibilities are. I'm asking myself all the time, what is my responsibility now? I'm 65 years old. I'm interested in reconciliation, but we need to work really hard on understanding the truth of our history, our Canadian history.
I don't necessarily think that naming streets or squares or public spaces in the name of Indigenous individuals is really counteracting that. I think that that's kind of just like apology politics. I think that it would be better to name it after someone who has had an influence on the contemporary society.
So you don't think that Indigenous people have a influence on contemporary society is what you're saying?
No,
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's a good question. I think that they do, but I think if you were to look at individuals who've had massive impacts in BC or Vancouver, I don't know if David Suzuki's from Vancouver, I think that would make sense to honor someone like him, or artists, public servants. Yeah, see, I don't even know who you would name it after. I just don't know who's had a positive impact on Vancouver lately.
We need to not alienate the people who are going to be really reactionary to these ideas, because as a human being, I know that old habits are hard to change, and people get really upset when they don't really understand necessarily why we're doing this, and if it happens really quickly, it could lead to some reactionary voting, which I'm really scared of too.
I do see that there is good value in honoring individuals who've aided Vancouver in contemporary times. And I think that just as they did in the 1800s, honoring someone from what would be then contemporary times, it makes sense to do that now.
What about a contemporary Indigenous?
Wow, that's a very interesting and controversial mix of opinions that you got there, Hannah. What was your takeaway from it?
The people who were against renaming the streets in Indigenous names, they brought up some interesting points. I can't say I agree with their points. One of the people that I interviewed said that he didn't want streets in Vancouver to be named after Indigenous names because he, as a white person, wouldn't be able to pronounce it, which I think is a little bit of a cop-out. One of the other people I interviewed said that she was afraid that if we were to rename the streets in Vancouver, she was for renaming it with Indigenous names, but she was afraid that would really cause a stir with people in Vancouver who are a bit more right-leaning and might not support that so much, and she was afraid that might cause some reactionary voting and, cause people to vote conservative where they might not have ordinarily. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for the interviews, Hannah.
No worries.
So that's all the time we have today for you folks. Thanks for listening to Democracy Watch on CITR at 101.9 FM. Tune in again next Thursday at 5 p.m. for more local news coverage. Also, remember to subscribe to our podcast, Seeking Office. Up next on CITR is the Spencer Latu Show. Take care and thank you for listening.